Welcome to my Road to Master series episode 2, where I'm trying to climb from 2000 ELO to an FM title. It will probably take many years, but that is the overall goal. And in this series, I'm analysing my over-the-board chess games, where I'm trying to gain rating, essentially. And if you saw episode 1, you'll know that I played an A3 Sicilian against my opponent, and that was a very, very interesting game, so go check it out. But the opening didn't really go to plan. So, big shout out to Daniel Naroditsky, who I'm sure you are all aware of, and if you are not, then what are you doing? Go check out his channel after this video. But he recommends c3 against the Sicilian, the Alapin Sicilian. So I thought, okay, let's learn this. Now, the reason I learned this is because I thought that I was playing against the same player that I did last week in the previous episode, because we were playing against the same team. However, the person who I thought I was going to play against actually was moved down a board to board 4, and I was playing on board 3, where we played last week. And my opponent, who I played last night, is stronger than the previous opponent, but he still played the Sicilian, so my opening prep was not in vain. So, the Alapin Sicilian, the point is literally just to, let's say black does nothing, let's say he just goes a6, we literally just want to go d4 and play take and get the big center. That's the goal, quite simply. Because normally in the Sicilian you get like knight to f3, and let's say black does nothing, then after d4 and take you get a knight on d4, whereas in the Alapin you want to get a pawn on d4 if possible, right, by playing this c3 move. But my opponent goes e6, and after d4, d5, this turns into a French defense, essentially. So it kind of switches, and if I go pawn to e5 in this position, we have transposed to a French defense advance variation. I didn't want to do that, and I kept in the spirit of the Alapin by taking on d5. In this position, my opponent surprised me already on move 4, because I was expecting something like ed5, and then after something like knight f3, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop d6, castles, something like this, I thought, okay, we'll get a game. I can take on c5, give black the isolated d-pawn, and I think I should have a long-term advantage. That was my plan. My opponent had different ideas. Instead of playing take and pawn takes, he took with the queen. And the idea is, taking with the queen in the Alapin is basically to say, okay, white doesn't have knight c3, kicking the queen away, because you've already committed the pawn to c3, so the queen is actually very safe on the d5 square. So we continue normal development with knight to f3, my opponent goes knight to c6, and here I think I spent about 10 minutes, which shows that this is the first time I've ever played this opening in a proper game, because I didn't know what to do here. I was deciding between bishop e2, bishop d3, and knight to a3. Those are my 3 candidate moves. I was also considering, can I get away with the move c4? Where the idea is, if I kick the queen, I can go pawn to d5, right? And that's something like take, knight back. I can go knight to c3, and I just have a completely dominant d-pawn. The problem is, though, that black doesn't have to retreat the queen. There is one move for black that saves the position, and it's queen to e4 check. And after I block the check, he can then take on d4, and after something like knight takes, queen takes, bishop takes, the position is completely equal. There's not much to be said about this. So I was like, okay, that's not an option. So I was trying to make knight to a3 work, with the idea being, if black plays a move like knight to f6, I was like, can I get away with knight to b5, trying to go after the c7 square? And after something like queen d8 defending, the engine likes dc5, bishop c5, queen d8, king d8. But I didn't really think this was a great plan, because I'm just going to get booted out with a6, and I'm going to have to retreat to some weird squares, most likely. Like here, the engine's top choice is knight d2 to meet a6 with knight b3, and after bishop back to b6 to go knight d6. This is all very strange stuff, and I'm not familiar enough with the opening to play it. So I went, instead of knight to a3, for bishop d3. Basically saying, okay, you can't play take, knight takes, queen takes because of bishop to b5 check. This pattern should be very familiar to you guys. It occurs in many different openings. So obviously the pawn isn't hanging. I was also considering bishop e2. Slightly more modest developing move. And if c takes and c takes, after something like knight to f6, then I can always now go knight to c3, hitting the queen. And although I have an isolated d-pawn, I feel like after castles, bishop e7, maybe bishop to e3, I have decent play around my isolated pawn. Although, you know, the black king is completely safe. Something like rook c1, looking for knight to e5. If black ever takes the knight on e5, then I have this very strong pawn on e5 where I should be better. And the whole idea of the bishop coming to e2, in my mind, is to give it easy access to the f3 square to look at this very nice diagonal. So after something like knight d5, queen d5, queen d5, e d5, bishop f3, something like this, I feel like we have a sustained advantage in this position. May well be a draw, but only white is winning this, basically. However, I went bishop d3 because I didn't consider this maneuver, which I'm now thinking more deeply about in future games. So hopefully this video will be useful for you guys to see how a higher rated player tries to understand a new opening as well. So anyway, bishop d3, as we've established, taking doesn't really work. Now, black can trade once. He can trade once and play something like knight to f6. But again, now I can go knight c3, hitting the queen. And yes, I have an isolated d-pawn. But again, I feel like I should have decent chances in this position when I eventually get the move knight to e5 in. One of the main ideas. So my opponent goes knight to f6. And in this position, I castle. My opponent goes bishop to e7. And the engine quite likes dc5, which I considered. The idea being that now the bishop has moved, if I take and the bishop takes, then black has wasted a tempo. You see that kind of thing in a lot of like Slav defense sort of lines, where black waits to take on c4 until the white bishop has moved to d3, so then it has to spend another tempo taking. And here, after like queen e2 castles, the engine likes bishop g5, and you know, pawn structure, I have this 3-on-2 on the queen side, so maybe I'm better long term. But I didn't like the idea of relinquishing control of the e5 square. So I went knight to a3. The engine calls this an inaccuracy. And my idea was, if black castles, then I can always drop the knight back to c2. And this is a common developing pattern for defending the d4 pawn. I was also thinking that cd4 was a very risky move for black, basically trying to open up the attack on the knight. So if I take back, maybe you can go bishop a3, ba3, and mess up my pawn structure, and I have an isolated d-pawn. But my plan was to play this nice move knight to b5, which I had seen, again, Daniel Naroditsky play in a speedrun episode before, this kind of idea. So after the queen goes back to defend the c7 square, I can take on d4 with the knight. And after knight takes, I have better development. After something like castles and rook e1, I've got better development. Something like queen f3, bishop f4, bishop g5, rook a d1. I have the 3-on-2 majority on the queen side, and I feel like I'm doing well here. My opponent, however, didn't take on d4, and he didn't castle either. He played this move a6. And here, there is one move for white to fight for the advantage, and it's knight c4. And I'm looking at the b6 square, basically. Now, this idea occurs in a different variation of the Sicilian that I normally play, the a3 Sicilian. And just you'll understand what I mean in a second. And this is also another reason why I'm playing the Alapin. It's because it does resemble the Mengarini Sicilian in quite a few ways. So after knight c6, pawn b4, take, knight takes, sacrificing a pawn to get the full center. After d5 take, queen takes, knight to a3, pawn to a6. This should look relatively similar. So compare this position with pawn a6 to this position with pawn a6. Yes, more things have moved around, but the general pawn structure is still quite similar, right? So I knew this kind of idea from the Mengarini Sicilian, where in this position, knight c4 is the best move, looking at the b6 square. And if something like queen back to d8, I can push moves like d5, and we have a very nice advantage after like the knight moves. And I think knight e5 is strong, bishop e3 is also decent. There's lots of different options for white. Sorry, I'm going well off course now, but I'm trying to demonstrate how the opening is relatively similar. So if any of you guys play the Mengarini Sicilian, which is what I normally play on the channel, the Alapin to me seems like a more solid version of the Mengarini. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. And be sure this game gets very interesting very soon. So in this position, I was expecting my opponent to play knight back to d7, covering b6, and also trying to stop me from playing knight to e5. Here, I was going to play knight to e3, hitting the queen, and after the queen moves, the engine recommends d5, and if ed5, I have knight to f5, which I didn't consider. I maybe would have found it had I got this position, though. Other than that, I figured we just have a decent position and we can just play for a small advantage. Engine thinks it's a big advantage, but I don't know the opening that well yet, so I figured this should be decent. My opponent went queen d8, which is the better option to defend the b6 square, though. And in this position, white has one move to fight for the advantage. And I didn't understand it, and I still don't really understand it. It's dc5, and after bishop c5, the engine wants pawn b4. If the bishop retreats to e7, it wants pawn a4. And I think the idea is to play a5, knight b6. I think. So let's say black castles, and we go pawn a5. Knight d5 covering p6, let's say. Queen c2 hitting the pawn. Pawn h6 saving the pawn. Rook d1 lining up the rook. Queen c7. It does want knight b6 because if takes, and takes, engine thinks we have good compensation after b5. Which, again, with this open a file against this pawn structure for black, that's also an idea from the Mengarini Sicilian, funnily enough. So I didn't really understand that idea. I instead played knight c to e5. If I'd have played take, b4, and the bishop retreats to a7, again a4, and if castles, then bishop f4, and let's say knight d5 again. Bishop g3. Bishop b8 is the best move, but let's say pawn h6. I'm still struggling to understand. We're also technically sacrificing this pawn, but I think if black takes it, then we have some nice ideas of queen c2, picking up the h7 pawn, and I suppose that's a fairly reasonable sacrifice. Also, bishop d6 is pretty deadly. Yeah, I mean, I guess this b4, a4 push looking for b5 in the future, or a5, knight b6 makes sense to me now, but I didn't consider it in the game, so I went for knight c to e5. My idea in this position was that if knight takes e5, I take back with the d pawn, and after the knight moves to d5, engine likes queen a4 check, and if bishop d7, queen g4, and this is a very common tactical pattern to go after the g7 pawn. If castles, we of course have bishop h6, pawn g6, and we pick up the exchange, and we're very, very happy. So I will also bear that pattern in mind in future. But I was more so thinking just like rook e1, keeping hold of the e-pawn, and after something like castles, queen c2, pawn g6, bishop h6, rook e8, I was like, we should be better in this position, and we absolutely are. Point is, this e5 pawn is just super, super strong, and it's very well defended. But my opponent surprised me, and he played the best move. He played cd4, and I was like, okay, I thought I prevented that move with knight e5, because I have knight c6 hitting the queen, forcing my opponent to take, and then I can take on d4 with tempo on c6, and black just has weak pawns. Now, this actually isn't the best way to go in this position, as in, like, this whole knight e5, knight c6 idea isn't the best. Again, taking here is better, or just bishop e3 defending the center. But I thought that we should have some long-term structural advantages, because in all endgames, these two pawns are going to be quite weak. And if I win one of them, then I'll have a 3-on-1 majority on the queen side. That was my idea. So my opponent goes bishop b7, of course, defending the pawn. And here I took about 20 minutes, I think. We get an hour 15 plus 15 minutes after move 35 with no increment. Weird time format, I must say. So here I was calculating a lot of different things. Firstly, I was trying to make queen f3 work. I rejected this on the basis of queen d5, because I thought that if I take and c takes, then black fixes his structure. And to be honest, I feel like I prefer black in this position. So I didn't want to take. I thought that queen g3 was incredibly risky because of pawn c5 opening up checkmate threats. And if I try to counterattack with queen g7, there's just rook g8 ideas, and I'm completely dead. So here the engine wants like knight back to c2, and after bishop d6, again I can't really take because of rook g8, and I'm getting slaughtered. So that's why I didn't go for queen to f3, because I didn't really want a queen trade. I felt like these pawns were weaker if I had the queen still on the board. I also considered queen a4, and I almost played this move. I thought it solved all of my problems. I thought after castles, knight c6 was an interesting option, but then I realized my bishop was hanging, so I was like, okay, probably rook d1 then, lining things up. And after something like queen b6, I feel like I have some decent play here. At least I'm not getting slaughtered on the king side, right? The reason I rejected queen a4 is because of this tricky e5 move. Because, of course, if I move my knight, my bishop hangs. There is this knight to f5 idea, where after queen takes d3, I have knight g7, and after king f8, bishop h6. I didn't really think this was a very good shout, because I didn't want to sacrifice an entire piece. So I was trying to calculate knight takes c6, because, of course, if take, then I'm good. If queen takes d3, I have knight takes e7 check, discovered check, of course. And if the king takes on e7, I have queen b4 forking the king and the bishop, which would be great. The problem is that black just has queen d7, and I lose my knight. My queen is undefended, so I can't move the knight, and I have no way to defend the knight. So I rejected queen to a4 as well. So queen f3 didn't work, queen a4 didn't work, so I was like, okay, I can't stop pawn to c5 then. This position also made me realize why the bishop is better on e2. Because let's say the bishop is on e2, and let's say black just wastes some moves triangulating. So let's say like queen d8, and it's my move. Then bishop f3 is very strong, and white is just better. Because if the pawn is pushed to c5, I obviously just take. So if black defends the pawn on c6 with a move like queen c7, then queen a4 is quite strong, and this would be a perfect position, essentially. If black defends with a move like rook to c8, I have no obligation to really push for some kind of advance, for some kind of big attack, because c5 just isn't going to happen. For a start, the pawn is pinned. The engine here lets knight b3, and after castles kingside, bishop f4, because the queen supports the bishop, and if bishop to d6, take, and I assume rook d1 should be pretty adequate to fight for the advantage. So this is the position where I realized, oh, my bishop should be on e2 in these lines, not d3 necessarily. But okay, I went bishop c2, and I thought this was a very good solution to the problem. Because if pawn c5, then I have bishop a4 check. And after the king moves, the engine likes knight c6 in this position, forking the pieces. And if something like take, then I'm just clearly better after something like, I don't know, rook c8. Here, there's bishop b7. But even after bishop to f3, white is clearly better with the bishop pair and these weak black pawns. But my opponent castled very, very quickly. And I realized, I haven't actually solved the problem. So I played queen e2, avoiding a queen trade. My opponent went pawn c5, and I went knight to f3. The position is completely equal, and my opponent plays this nice queen to c7 move. Just getting the pieces ready, maybe queen c6 is on the horizon. Here, I should play knight to e5, and I went bishop g5, and I immediately regretted it. I was like, oh my god, knight e5 is clearly the move. One, it stops queen c6, but more importantly for me is if black plays a move like rook a8, is I wanted to play bishop f4, lining up the queen and the bishop. And after something like bishop d6, rook a d1, I can't really be worse in this position, I felt, because I'm clogging up the center and stopping any attack that black might have. And if black ever takes, then I just have the bishop pair, and I have to be better here. So I played bishop g5, and I immediately regretted it. And in this position, my opponent thought for a while, and then played a very nice move. Can you find a really nice move for black in this position? Because my opponent spent a while on this. I think he's underrated at 2010 and 11 elo. I would say. Can you find the move he played? Pause the video. Knight g4. Knight g4. A killer move. A killer move. And what's the point? Well, everything is under attack. My knight is under attack. h2 is under attack. My bishop is under attack. I'm attacking h7. I'm also attacking his bishop. I'm x-raying his knight. There's so much going on in this position. If I play a move like pawn h3, I lose on the spot because of bishop takes f3. If I take the bishop, I get mated on h2. That's the whole point. Black wants to eliminate my knight with tempo on my queen. So I considered the move pawn g3, just shutting off this diagonal. But I thought I have to be worse in this position. After bishop f3, queen f3, and something like knight h2 attacking my queen. Here the engine suggests bishop h7 check. But let's say king h2 and bishop g5. There's opposite colored bishops, but I am down a pawn. Maybe I can draw this position. So I decided the best way for me to defend was bishop e4. Now the engine thinks queen d3 is a better move, which I also considered, counter-attacking h7. So if black takes on f3, I just mate him. And making essentially making sure that bishop f3 doesn't come with tempo on the queen. So after pawn to g6, the engine likes bishop e7, because if bishop takes f3... of course, if I take the bishop, I get mated. There is this very cool bishop to d6 move, counter-attacking the queen. And after the queen moves, and queen f3, if queen d6, I can take the knight. All very good. But of course, black doesn't have to do that. After pawn to g6, black can just do something else after bishop takes e7. Here the engine suggests an insane rook f to d8. Sacrificing the rook, because after rook takes, I have to move the queen, and then bishop takes f3, and I can't recapture because of mate. So here I'd have to play pawn g3, and I'm up in exchange, but I'm getting completely trampled with this knight h2, followed by rook d5, looking for checkmate. So I basically just have to sacrifice my queen, and there's very little else I can do. And here, my king is so weak. I'm completely losing. So the engine calls this an inaccuracy. It says queen d3 is better, but I don't agree. I don't agree. I think this was the best move, and my opponent said that he thought it was the only move after the game. So here, there is a way for black to win a pawn, which when I played bishop e4, I didn't see. And then once he took on e4, I realized what the threat was. So after take, if my opponent takes on g5, then I take the knight. The point is that black has two hanging pieces. So, if he has two hanging pieces, there's a solution. There's a desperado. And it's knight takes h2. And when my opponent played this move, I was actually... I was frustrated that I'd given up a pawn. Because basically... if I take here, then my opponent takes my bishop because it's now undefended. And, I mean, the bishop is clearly better than my knight. So I took on e7. My opponent takes on f3 with check. That's the big idea. And after take, I'm down a pawn. But after I played rook fd1, and my opponent played queen c7, stopping my infiltration on c6, and I went rook d2, I think my opponent played rook ad8, I played rook ad1, and I think I offered him a draw. And you may be saying, okay, Alex, really? Did you offer him a draw in this position? Well, I couldn't see a way for black to actually win the game. Because I was thinking, okay, if rook d2, which is what happened, if my opponent goes rook d8, then I'm just better. I have some insane moves like queen c6. And if take, then I mate black. So, if the queen moves, then I can just play something like take, and queen c5 or queen a6. And if anything, white is better. So I was like, okay, black can't really trade. He can't really trade both pairs of rooks, which means that I have the d-file. There was also another very interesting line. Let me see if I can remember what it was. There was some very interesting line. I think it was rook d2, queen e5. Something like queen c... No, not queen c6, so queen e1 check. What was the idea? There was some interesting idea that I'd come up with. Basically, the back rank is very exposed. That's all you need to know. And also, I figured if black tries something like rook a to b8, and I go for something like rook a d1, then I'm probably better because I control the d-file and my rook's coming to d7 sort of thing. But what my opponent did is he traded on d2 and he played this very nice move, queen e5, threatening queen to e1 check ideas, picking up my rook. So in this position, I was trying to play quickly because he was getting lower on the clock. Here the best move is rook d1. But I thought that queen to d3 was a better idea, trying to encourage queen e1 check, because after king to h2, f2 is defended, b2 is defended, and I'm not necessarily trying to win all of his pawns, I'm just trying to make sure he can't get too active. If I can keep this rook at bay, obviously the rook can't move because I just have mate in 2, right? The rook has to stay on f8. I figured that, being down one pawn wasn't actually a big deal because my 3-on-2 is quite strong. So I went queen d3. My opponent played the best move, pawn g6, and here the engine thinks that black is almost good enough to be winning. From a human perspective, I still think this is very drawish. So I played rook d1 because I was considering rook e2 in this position. And I was calculating queen d5, queen a6, because if queen d1 check, my rook is defended. But I thought that in this position, after rook to d8, I have to be worse. Material is equal, but I just thought I was clearly worse. I don't see how I actually play for any kind of activity in this position. My pieces are just stumbling over each other. And I was correct to think that. That would have been a bad idea. The engine suggests playing take, and I considered this, but I thought it was ridiculous to voluntarily go for this endgame after c4. c4 was the big problem. Here the engine wants take, rook c7, rook b1, king h2, rook b2, f3, rook a2, rook c4, and theoretically this should be a draw. But I wasn't completely confident, and I also thought it was easier to draw with the queens on the board rather than the rooks on the board. I figured rook trade guarantees a draw. So I played rook d1. My opponent went rook b8, attacking b2. I played pawn to b3, just defending the pawn, and my opponent went pawn a5, looking for pawn to a4 to break open my position. Here the engine likes queen f3, and if pawn a4, it wants rook d7, attacking the f7 square. And after queen f5 defending, it suggests rook b7. If take, then I take with check. So you can't take the queen. And if you take here, again, if the rooks come off the board, it should be a draw, is what I had considered, I should have easy perpetual checks, basically, which you'll see later on is an idea. I went queen c4, though. The idea being that I was baiting my opponent into playing a4, because I was like, I'll happily take that pawn, not a problem. My opponent went king g7, getting out of any back rank checks. And here I went rook d7, which the engine says is inaccurate, but my opponent was very low on time in this position. And I had about 20 minutes. My opponent maybe had 6. Here, the best move is rook d3, guarding the c3 pawn. And after rook e1, sorry, queen e1 check, king h2, if my opponent takes on f2, after rook to f3, queen, no, not e2, the d2, and queen c5, the engine thinks I'm doing okay. Queen e5 is a threat, picking up the rook. So after rook to d8, queen e5 still, and if king g8, queen a5, queen d6 check. I still feel quite uncomfortable in this position because my king is just so exposed. The material is equal, but my king is so exposed. So I went rook d7, and here black should play queen e1 check, king h2, queen f2, which I had calculated. And here I was going to play queen takes e6, looking to threaten the f7 pawn and also queen e5 check ideas. I had missed queen f4 check here. And if I move my king back to g1, there is... Oh, I missed rook d8. I missed rook d8. Okay, that's the whole idea. I was thinking more along the lines of rook to f8. And I thought that I should have enough activity to hold. The engine doesn't think so. Doesn't think so, interestingly. But that was what I was going to go for. I thought that I had enough pressure. But again, my opponent was low on time. So he instead played pawn a4. So I took. And then he took on c3, which I was like, what? I thought he was for sure going to go queen e1 check, king h2, queen f2. I thought this was the idea. And after something like queen back to c4... Of course, I don't care if my opponent tries to give me a perpetual check, although he can't because I'm covering all the checking squares. Here, the engine likes queen f5, and here I thought I should have some decent counterplay with my a-pawn. Black is better, but again, my opponent is so low on time. This is very complicated. You know, if he goes rook to a8 in this position, engine likes king g1, getting out of checks. But I figured it was hard for black to actually prove an advantage here. Like, how does black actually move? Because he's obviously got a 4-on-1 on the king side, but his king is on the king side. And if he starts pushing pawns, e5 immediately equalizes the position, according to the engine after queen d5. Sorry, rook d5, forking the pawns. So I thought it was very difficult, practically, for black to play this position. He took on c3, which I could understand, because now the threat is queen e1 check, picking up the f2 pawn. And let's say I play a lazy move like queen a7 in this position. After something like... okay, queen e1 check isn't very good, apparently, because I guess it hangs the c5 pawn. After rook f8 defending the f7 pawn, my only move is g3, otherwise I'm losing. If I try, I don't know, queen c7... Then after something like queen e1 check, king h2, queen f2, I'm down 2 pawns, and I just don't have enough counterplay. So after queen c3, there is one move here that saves the game for white. Can you find the move? Can you find the move? And I think my opponent missed this move. And it's rook f7 check. Of course, the idea that we want to play is either queen a7 or queen f4, attacking the rook and attacking the f7 square. But the rook can always just move to f8 to defend the f7 square. So we change the move order. This is how you find a lot of tactics, is by changing the move order. First, we go rook f7 check. If black declines the rook, king j8 is the only way to do so. I think my opponent was considering this. But after something like queen f4 attacking the rook and defending my rook, here black has to go queen a1 check. And after king h2, he has to find queen d4. Because if I take, then he takes. And if I take on d4 after c takes d4 and rook d7, pawn e5 defending, this is a very strange position. To be honest, I would probably just take his rook, I think. I think I'd probably just take the rook and play this position. Because again, I feel like the queen versus queen should be a draw because of how weak the black pawns are. Also, a bit of context. It was about 10 p.m. at this point in the game. After I played rook f7, I could barely keep my eyes awake. I could barely keep my eyes open. I'd been down a pawn for quite a while at this point in the game. I'd already offered my opponent a draw, so I was in the draw mindset. I just wanted to get out of there and go home. I wanted to go home. I felt like I'd done my job. Also, because it's a team format, it's a 5 versus 5. 2 of my teammates had already lost, and a couple of them who were still playing didn't have great positions. So I figured we'd lost the match regardless. So I was like, okay, there's not stakes for me to win this. So king f7, I went queen f4 check. My opponent went king g7. And I can take the rook in this position. And after something like queen e1, king h2, queen f2, I have queen e5 check, king f7. And I'm down a pawn. I can keep giving checks if something like king f6, queen h7. But I didn't really have the stamina to be wanting to do this. Again, I wake up at I think that yesterday I woke up at 5:30 in the morning. So me and my girlfriend could go to the gym before I dropped her off at work. So I was not wanting, I needed sleep. I couldn't keep my eyes open. So I went queen c7 check, king h6. I went queen h2 check. I considered queen to f4 check. The point is I keep giving checks while keeping an eye on the rook, right? And the rook can't block the checks. The queen can't block the checks. Here, I was slightly concerned about pawn to g5. And if queen h2, king g6, I now have to take on b8. And after something like here, here, and here, I wasn't thrilled, although I do have queen g8 check in this position, forking everything. So I probably could have played this position. And this is quite nice. It's an easy draw. If not, white might be better, to be fair. My opponent went king g7. I went queen c7. My opponent went king h6. I went queen to h2. I offered my opponent a draw. And then he went king g5. And now I have to take the rook because I don't have a check on g3 and I don't have a check on e5. So I have to take the rook now. And my opponent went queen a1 check, which again surprised me. I thought he was going to go queen e1 check. And after I moved, pick up the f2 pawn. I thought this was his idea. And after something like queen to e5 check, queen f5, I just was looking for some kind of perpetual. After queen g3, king f6, here. I mean, engine likes king g1, likes pawn b4, likes pawn a4. If queen c3, I get hit with queen e5 check, forcing a queen trade. And then I'm just losing. So you have to be very, very careful. But my opponent went queen a1 check and took on a2. And here, I was like, oh, okay. His queen is kind of out of the game. Why has he done that? I was initially calculating queen e5 check, king h6, queen c5, queen b3, queen f8, king g5, queen e7. I was calculating this line, and I was like, I can't calculate this all the way, and I'm also down a pawn. In fairness, it's kind of obvious that if king f5, I can just take eventually. Well, I can keep giving checks. And I can eventually, if black gets out of all the checks somehow, I can take on h7. And then if anything, white is better, because the black pawns are split. But after queen e5 check, I actually have a more interesting move here. Pawn to f4 check, which I didn't consider. And here, black can get checkmated very quickly, right? Like, king f5 would be mate in 2. The pawn is defended by my queen, of course. If the king goes back to h6, then I have queen to f8 check. And after the king comes up to h5, I have moves like queen f6, threatening queen g5 checkmate. And if pawn h6 defending, I have queen takes e6, threatening... Well, I suppose he can't take because I defend that. But I also have like g4 ideas. I have queen to h3 checkmate ideas. So after g5 giving an escape route, I have king h3 threatening other checkmates, and black is completely losing. But I had briefly considered, and I was thinking about this in bed afterwards, for probably about half an hour, visualizing this position, because I'd done a brief analysis before I went to bed, and the Lee chess engine thought that this was winning for white, but I wasn't sure because I was calculating, okay, king g4, queen e5 threatening mate, pawn h6 only move to stop this. After queen e6, king f4, I was like, white is probably better, but I don't want this. I don't want this complication. I'm still down a pawn. And if I'm reckless and I take on g6 and black takes on b3, I can take on h6 with check, and the engine says this is a draw. But in my mind, only black wins this because his c-pawn is way further up the board than my g-pawn. I should have some kind of perpetual check, but I could also mess up the position. Now, my opponent was very low on time, so there are arguments to be made for actually playing this out because my opponent was so low on time. Maybe I could have done that. But I played queen e5 check, and after king h6, I have a move that just ends the game in a draw very quickly, and it's pawn f4. The black king is trapped in a box. My opponent was very frustrated. He was trying to play for a win. He took on b3. He has no other option. And here I go queen g5 check, queen e7 check, queen e8 check, and the king is trapped between these squares. He can never ever get out, and that's it. So after queen e8 check, my opponent offered me a draw, and I of course accepted it. Very interesting game, and I was thrilled with the Alapin Sicilian. Of course, I've only studied the opening for like a day, literally the day of the game yesterday. And the opening went incredibly well. I would highly recommend it to people, and I'm going to try and learn it more. And I will still play my Mengarini Sicilian as a bit of a secret weapon, because I do like it. But the Alapin seems like basically just a better version of the A3 Sicilian to me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope the analysis wasn't too drawn out, or, I hope I didn't go into too many random lines that you didn't really understand. Please leave me feedback down below, because these videos will probably be coming out every week, because I will probably have over-the-board games every single week, roughly. And yeah, I was very happy with this result, to be honest. I played against a very strong player. If you want to see episode 1 of my Road to Master, then check out the video up here. That was a wild game. More wild than this, for sure. Although this was very interesting. And if you want to see some of my A3 Sicilian games, then I'll link the playlist down there. But I'll definitely be learning the Alapin. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.